everybody, and welcome back to my series on how the Gospels became history, Jesus and Mediterranean myths. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 13, entitled Disappearance and Recognition. These are scenes in which the hero, in this case, the major figure of comparison being Jesus, disappears and hides his identity but is later recognized. I'm going to be looking at stories which also share these themes and tropes in the larger Greco-Roman world so that we can get a full set of comparisons. And along the way, I'm going to be hinting, at least, that a lot of these stories have realism and historical realism. We might call it magical realism in the lingo of modern literary criticism, which is to say that although these events are fantastical, disappearing in thin air, not being recognized, then being magically recognized, the overall texture of the narrative is plain history and fairly sober historical prose with fairly believable characters. And this is what allowed the Gospels to fit in the general genre of historiography, or more precisely, Greek historia. Now, if any of you have read Homer's epics, you'll know that the gods are everywhere, but people don't see them because there's a mist over our eyes by nature. And when this mist is removed, as in the case of the Iliad, the hero is able to see the gods running loose on the battlefield, part of the action. When Odysseus is able to see, he's able to see his patroness, Athena, who comes to him in various guises, but only when she allows him to see does Odysseus see. This theme gets repeated in all sorts of literature. The gods in the Homeric line are difficult to recognize. And this appears to be the same kind of theme and trope that we find in the Emmaus episode in Luke, where Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, approaches two previously unintroduced disciples, starts a conversation with them on the road to Emmaus, and although they've known him and seen him, apparently every day for the past few months, they're unable to recognize him. And they only recognize him when he gives forth a sign, a token of who he was, of his identity. In this case, the token is the breaking of bread. In the case of other gods and goddesses, it can be the way that they walk. It can be their smile. It can be a flash of beauty. And it's often the case that this identity marker is only revealed at the final moment, right before the god either disappears or flies away. Aristeas of Proconesus is one of my favorite characters in historical writing, in this case, Herodotus. And Aristeas is very fascinating because he dies in the ancient equivalent of a laundromat while the owner is present. The owner, seeing that Aristeas has died, locks up the shop, leaves the body on site, locks up the shop, and runs to tell the relatives of Aristeas. And when the relatives come, they unlock the shop, but lo and behold, there is no body. And on their way out, they scratch their heads and they meet someone who informs them that just a few minutes ago, he saw Aristeas walking on the road, greeted him as if there was no problem at all, as if he had not died. He looked completely normal. And it was said that this Aristeas, to prove his true life, left behind a poem. And there's even the report that some 240 years later, Aristaeus appeared hundreds of kilometers away in southern Italy, where he gave instructions to a city on the worship of Apollo and instructed them to build him a statue in association with Apollo, a direction later confirmed by the Oracle of Delphi. Aristaeus, in short, was alive. He could disappear and reappear in various places. He was truly a divine being and recognized as the divine being in a state cult in southern Italy. And although, of course, he didn't gain the popularity of Jesus, his story shows that the idea of death, resurrection, disappearance, teleportation, this could be told in a historiographical work. Now, comparing this with Luke, in a story which many Christians today view as historical, we have Jesus breaking the bread, disappearing, and then reappearing, supposedly 7 miles away in Jerusalem at the upper room where the disciples were gathered. And this is quite a magical kind of event. It's quite a fantastical kind of event. And yet, it is within the texture of a seemingly historical account where there are real humans with real surprised reactions who are amazed at what has occurred and yet find some way that they can believe. This is the kind of magical realism or fantastical element connected, linked to a historical or historical like tale that the Gospels tell so well. But Jesus, in fact, isn't unique in this kind of disappearance and teleportation. Iamblichus reveals that there were stories about Pythagoras who could teleport or bilocate. That is, he could be seen and heard in a public setting in two cities at once. And we have cases of him disappearing and then appearing again in another city at the same time. Stories like this are also told of Apollonius of Tyana, who, in his famous trial scene before Domitian in the life of Apollonius of Tyana, vanishes and appears before his distraught disciples, showing them that he has power to escape any chain, any prison. And this theme really goes back, far back, if you remember, to Euripides' Bacchae, where Pentheus tries to contain Dionysus. And Dionysus tells him, "You can lock the doors, but don't you think that gods can go through walls or go over walls, to be precise?" Well, of course, that's what gods do. That's the sort of thing that gods can achieve. And it's the sort of thing that Jesus does when he walks through walls to meet the disciples in a locked upper room. One of the most famous scenes in the Gospels is the story in John where Doubting Thomas, or so called Doubting Thomas, is invited to touch the wounds of Jesus, to put his entire finger in the hole in Jesus' side. And this is quite extraordinary and supposed to be an indication of his real presence, despite the fact that he just walked through a wall. Now, what's interesting is there are actually stories that are not dissimilar to what we have in the Gospel of John. For instance, the story of Protesilaus, who, according to Philostratus in his Heroicus, was said to have come back to life and to wander in a certain region. Now, many of you may not know who Protesilaus was. Protesilaus was famous in Greek history and poetry for being the very first Greek soldier who leapt off the prow of his ship onto Trojan soil. And there was a prophecy that whoever did so would lose his life, and Protesilaus was speared in the thigh. So it's no surprise then that the Protesilaus who was restored to life could readily show the scar on his thigh to those who met him. And the fact that he had a real presence is indicated by his ability to embrace people, to walk with them, to talk with them, and even to kiss them. These and many other stories you can find in chapter 13 of How the Gospels Became History. I leave the bibliographical information here. I've got my Amazon page in the description. Go check out the book. I hope you'll look up the notes and the references and all the extra reading that I suggest. This is an opportunity for you, hopefully, to go deeper and to compare those stories which set the frame for how ancient readers would have read the Gospels and would have understood the Gospels. This is the argument of the book, and I hope that you can go deeper than this very brief presentation I've been able to offer here. Thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate all of you having a listen. I hope all of you are able to benefit from these videos, even in small ways, maybe large ways. If so, consider supporting me on Patreon, where you can dialogue with me and ask questions and even meet me if you'd like. I wish all of you well and take care.